Here's the number. Write it down. $257 billion. That is how much China traded with the 6 Gulf states in 2024 alone. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain. $257 billion in a single year. Now, here's the second number. The same year, total Gulf trade with the entire Western world, the United States, Europe, all of it, came in at $256 billion. China just overtook the entire West as the Gulf's largest trading partner. For the first time ever, according to the report published by Asia House in London, November 2025. And I want you to notice something. Nobody in Washington called a press conference. Nobody in Western press treated this as a civilizational headline it actually is. It got a few financial columns as a brief mention and then silence. That silence tells you everything about this video, because here is what Washington still believes: that the region is, in the words of 2025 national security strategy, no longer constant irritant it was. That the situation is, quote, manageable. The gap between the belief and what is actually happening is what this video is about. If you have watched my previous video on this channel, you already know the structural argument. You know why the framework predicts that external pressure on a civilization rooted in deeper principles tend to produce the opposite of its intended result. You know the evidence from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Iran's missile program, but here is what those videos did not cover. The collapse is not just military. It is not just political. It is happening in 3 dimensions simultaneously. Dimensions that the most Western analysts are not even tracking yet. The first dimension is information, the battle for the narrative. Who tells the story of this region and to whom is being lost in real time. And the numbers are staggering. The second dimension is economic, the financial architecture that the West used to translate military power into structural control, the petrodollar, dollar dominance, the assumption that Gulf states would keep their wealth in US treasuries. That architecture is quietly fracturing, transaction by transaction, platform by platform. The third dimension is the most extraordinary. The United States government and its own official document does not appear to know any of this is happening. Its strategy documents still use a framework that stopped describing the reality years ago. And that's the gap between the framework Washington uses and the world that actually exists. That the gap is growing wider every month. This is what losing looks like in 21st century. It does not look like a surrender ceremony. It looks like this. Let me be precise about what I'm claiming. I'm not claiming that America is militarily defeated. It is not. I'm not claiming that the US has zero influence in the Middle East. It has some. I'm not claiming that the region has already built a fully formed alternative order. It has not. What I'm claiming is this. The 3 mechanisms by which the US has mentioned structural dominance in the Middle East, its narrative control, its financial architecture, and its strategic doctrine are all 3 breaking down simultaneously. And that the pace of that breakdown is accelerating. More specifically, I'm claiming that the framework that I have been drawing on these videos predicted exactly this sequence of events. And it predicted that the transition would be visible in the financial, informational, and ideological dimensions of the power, not just military one. Every one of those predictions is now verifiable in current data. And let me show you why, taken together, they amount to something that I think history will look back on as a turning point. We will start with the information war, because the story of who wins the narrative battle in 2026 and who is losing it is more dramatic than anything Hollywood could write. In summer 2024, the Reuters Institute for a Study of Journalism published its annual digital news report. They surveyed nearly 100,000 people across 47 markets, covering more than half of the world's population. Here's what they found. In the global south, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the fastest changing variable in the media consumption was this. TikTok use for news had grown to 23% among adults aged 18 to 24. But that global average hides something even more dramatic. In Peru, Colombia, Morocco, Nigeria, South Africa, markets where younger populations are reshaping the information landscape, TikTok was not just a social platform. It was becoming a primary news channel. And what was being consumed on that channel? When it came to the Middle East, the content that dominated was not CNN, it was not the BBC, it was not the New York Times. It was raw footage, first-person accounts, unmediated reality. Think about what it means structurally. For 70 years, the West maintained a near monopoly on how global events were framed. It controls the camera, it controlled the distribution, it controlled the language, terrorism or resistance, militants or fighters, conflict or occupation. Those word choices were not accidents. They were architecture. They shaped what billions of people were permitted to think. That architecture is breaking. Al Jazeera English by Q2 2025 had grown its Instagram engagement by 26% in a single quarter, more than 35 million engagements between April and June. Its audience in Africa, particularly in South Africa, was growing faster than any comparable Western outlet. Its coverage reached communities that Western press had written up as peripheral. But here is the number that hit me hardest when I found it. CNN's primetime viewership in 2025 was 570,000 people. Total day audience, 432,000. Compare that to 2017. From 2017 to 2025, CNN lost more than 40% of its total audience. That is not a rating dip. That is an institutional collapse of credibility. Now, CNN would tell you this is a domestic story, partisan politics, cord cutting, the rise of streaming. And domestically, that is partially true. But look at the global South numbers. Trust in Western media outlets, specifically among population in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, did not just decline, it fell off a cliff in 2023 and 2024, precisely as the coverage of Gaza made the gap between what people were seeing on their phones and what Western outlets were reporting completely impossible to ignore. I want you to sit with that for a second. Millions of people in Global South watched the same raw footage. They watched the numbers. They watched the language their media was using to describe it. And then they made a decision. The decision was not just, I do not trust this outlet. The decision was deeper than that. It was the framework this outlet uses to describe the world does not correspond to the world I can see with my own eyes. That is not just media story, that is a civilizational realignment in how the majority of the world's population process reality. But wait, it gets more significant. Because TikTok is not just a passive delivery mechanism. In the framework I have been drawing on, the narrative battle is fought on multiple levels simultaneously. The military dimension is the one we can see. The information dimension is the one that determines whether the military outcome means anything. If you win the physical fight but lose the story of the fight, the next generation of your opponent is already forming. A peer-reviewed study published in 2024 documented exactly this dynamic. Among younger population across the global south, TikTok had become the primary vehicle for what that researchers called a mass political awakening, a wholesale rejection of the pro-Western frame and a repositioning of the conflict within a colonial analysis. Not just sympathy, a framework shift. The West did not lose the information war because it ran bad campaigns. It lost because the technology that distributes the information is now neutral. And neutral distribution of reality at scale turns out to be devastating for a narrative that depends on controlling what people see. The first mechanism of Western dominance in the Middle East just broke. In 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia struck a deal that would define the global financial order for the next 50 years. Oil would be priced and sold in US dollars. Saudi Arabia would invest its surplus oil revenues in US Treasury bond, recycling the petrodollars back into the American financial system. In exchange, the United States would provide security guarantees to the kingdom. That arrangement was not just about oil. It was the mechanism by which US military power translated into US financial hegemony. Every country that needed oil needed dollars. Every country that needed dollars was structurally linked to the US financial system. The dollar was not just a currency, it was a control architecture. That arrangement ran for exactly 50 years. On June 9th, 2024, the Joint Commission that formalized it expired. Saudi Arabia chose not to renew it. Now, I want you to be careful here because this is a story where the details matter. The petrodollar arrangement was never a single formal treaty. It was informal. Saudi Arabia did not in June 2024 announce that it would stop selling oil in dollars. It has not done so. If anyone claims that the petrodollar deal collapsed overnight, they are overstating it. But here's what actually happening, which is more interesting than the simplified version. Saudi Arabia joined mBridge in June 2024 as a full member. mBridge is a multi-central bank digital currency settlement platform connecting the central banks of China, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Thailand, and Hong Kong. It enables real-time cross-border settlement without using the dollar as an intermediary, without routing through SWIFT at any point. In early 2022 pilots, mBridge processed about $22 million in transactions. By November 2025, it had processed more than $55 billion across 4,047 transactions. That is a 2,500-fold increase in 3 years. And 95% of that volume was settled in China's digital yuan. Let me say that again. The country that invented the petrodollar in 1974, Saudi Arabia, is now a full member of a platform specifically designed to settle energy transactions without a single dollar changing hands. In November 2023, the People's Bank of China and the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority signed a currency swap agreement worth nearly $7 billion. That means both central banks can settle transactions directly in their own currency without needing to convert to dollar as an intermediary. In October 23, the first crude oil purchase settled in China's digital yuan took place. Saudi Arabia joined the mBridge platform 6 months later. That is not theoretical. That is live, operational, happening now. But let me give you the bigger picture. 5 new countries formally joined BRICS as members on January 1st, 2024. Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Ethiopia. 5 countries simultaneously. And look at the geography. 2 of the world's largest oil exporters. The largest economy in Africa. The country that just had its nuclear program partially degraded by external strikes, but has survived as a state. The financial hub of the Gulf. The BRICS expansion is not a club, it is a signaling mechanism. It is of each of these governments publicly declaring that they intend to operate within financial and diplomatic architecture that is not organized around Washington. Now let me be precise again. BRICS is not NATO. It does not have a unified army. It does not have a single currency yet. Saudi Arabia has not turned its back on the United States. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed a mutual defense pact in September 2025. Saudi Arabia is still buying US military equipment. The hedging is real. The pivot is not complete. But here's the point that the framework makes with extraordinary clarity. You do not need the transition to be complete for it to be structurally decisive. You need it to pass a threshold. You need it to reach a point where the numbers of a credible alternative to dollar-based settlement, to US military security, guarantees to Western financial architecture exceeds zero. Because once it exceeds zero, the nature of the leverage changes. The Gulf state can now credibly say to Washington, we have options. We do not have to take your calls. We do not have to accept your conditions. That shift from no option to options is the civilizational transition. China overtook the entire West as the Gulf's largest trading partner in 2024. $257 billion versus $256 billion for the entire Western world. 1 year and the total Gulf Asia trade, China, Japan, South Korea, India, hit $560 billion, roughly double the value of the Gulf West trade. The center of the gravity of the Gulf economy has moved. The financial architecture is being rewired, and it's being done quietly, incrementally, transition by transition, platform by platform, exactly the way the framework predicted it would happen. Not with a dramatic announcement, with a 2,500-fold increase in a settlement volume that almost nobody in Western media covered. The second mechanism of the Western dominance in the Middle East just broke. In December 2025, the Trump administration released its national security strategy. It is a remarkable document for reasons that have nothing to do with what it says. It is remarkable for what it reveals about the gap between official Washington's self-understanding and the world that actually exists. The document describes the Middle East as follows. It says, and I'm quoting directly, the days in which the Middle East dominated American foreign policy in both long-term planning and day-to-day execution are thankfully over. Not because the Middle East no longer matters, because it is no longer the constant irritant and potential source of imminent catastrophe that it once was. Think about what that sentence contains. The 2025 NSS was written while China was overtaking the entire Western world as the Gulf's largest trading partner, while Saudi Arabia had joined a dollar bypass settlement platform, while BRICS had just expanded to include 5 Middle Eastern and African nations simultaneously, while Al Jazeera's engagement was surging and CNN was decreasing credibility across the global south. And official Washington's assessment was manageable, thankfully resolved. The INSS, the Israeli think tank that analyzed this document in December 2025, noted that something extraordinary. The Middle East is framed in the document's own logic as in a case that has been handled. Iran weakened, nuclear program damaged, Gaza ceasefire in place, regional normalization advancing. What the document does not contain any analysis of the financial realignment, any reference to BRICS expansion, any engagement with the information war dynamics, any acknowledgement that China has structurally displaced the West as the Gulf's primary economic partner. Now consider the 2026 National Defense Strategy, the Pentagon's companion document. It was being debated in March 2026. In congressional testimony, while the U.S. military was simultaneously conducting a strike on Iran, and senators on the Armed Services Committee told the Pentagon's policy chief directly that the document had flawed proposal that was in many cases obsolete. Obsolete. That is a U.S. senator describing the Pentagon's own strategic framework. But wait, here is the deeper pattern. Pull back to the Biden administration's national security strategy of 2022. That document's approach to the Middle East was 5 principles. Support rules-based order partners, prevent any power from dominating the region militarily, ensure freedom of navigation, prevent WMD proliferation, advance regional integration. Sound familiar? Those were also roughly the principle of the Bush strategy and the Obama strategy before that. The language shifted, the framework did not. The framework assumes that the central variable is how much American power can be brought to bear on a given situation. The framework assumes that the money, military presence, and diplomatic pressure are the levers that determine outcomes. The framework assumes that the other civilizations are essentially responsive to those levers, that they have no internal organization principles that can absorb, redirect, or outlast external pressure. What evidence shows consistently across 20 years is that this assumption is wrong, specifically for this region, specifically for this civilizational context. The framework drew on an observation that is not almost embarrassingly clear in the data. When a power crosses certain structural threshold in its relationship with another civilization, and its financial tools begin working against it. The pressure that was meant to prevent Iran from building missiles produced an Iran with missiles. The economic correction that was meant to isolate the Gulf from China produced a Gulf that made China its primary trading partner. The narrative controls that was meant to maintain Western credibility produced a generation in Global South that now treats a Western media as the least credible source of information on the world. This is not a coincidence, it is a structural pattern, and the framework saw it coming. But here is the most important dimension of all. The framework also predicted something specific about opposing powers' cognition. It predicted that the power that was being structurally displaced would not understand what was happening to it. Not because it was stupid, because its own framework for understanding the world would actively prevent it from seeing the displacement as displacement. A civilization that believes it's operating from a position of inherent strength, inherent legitimacy, and inherent organizational superiority does not perceive incremental displacement. It perceives problem. It perceives challenges. It perceives setbacks that can be managed. What it cannot perceive is the ground has shifted beneath its feet. And that perceptual gap between what official Washington believes and what the data shows is not narrowing, it's widening. Now, let me bring the framework back in, not to repeat what we covered before, but to apply it specifically to these 3 new dimensions. In our earlier videos, we discussed the 3 laws that framework draws from historical analysis. Law 1, pressure purifies. Law 2, apparent defeat contains the next advance. Law 3, the narrative battle is not secondary, it is decisive. Each of those laws maps directly onto what we just documented. But application in 2026 looks different from historical cases we examined previously. Let me show you why. Law 1 in 2026 operates economically, not just militarily. The sanction pressures on Iran produce an indigenous missile program, but the broader financial pressure on the entire Middle East, the dollar hegemony, the SWIFT architecture, the IMF conditionality, that broader pressure is what produced the mBridge platform, the Yuan swap agreements, the BRICS expansion. The pressure was so comprehensive that the response had to be comprehensive. Saudi Arabia joining the dollar bypass settlement platform is not ideological. It is structural. It is what happens when the cost of the dependence on a single financial architectures become high enough. The pressure produced the alternative. Law 2 in 2026 operates informationally, not just militarily. After every kinetic operation, 2006, 2008, 2014, the 2024-2025 strikes, the Western analysis was the resistance has been degraded. The capability has been set back. The framework assumed that physical degradation translates into informational degradation. It does not. After each operation, the number of the people globally who had reclassified, their understanding on conflict increased. Not because of the propaganda, because of the footage, because of the numbers, because the raw reality distributed at a scale is not controllable. What appears to be an advance in physical domain is simultaneously generating an advance in the informational domain for the other side. Law 3 in 2026 is where the synthesis becomes clear. The narrative battle is not separate theater from the economy in a strategic theater. It is the same theater. When China becomes the Gulf's largest trading partner, that is not just trade statistic. It is a statement about whose story the Gulf is now embedded in. When Saudi Arabia joins mBridge, it is not just a payment mechanism. It is a declaration of where the center of the gravity of its future is located. When a generation in Global South decides that Western media is not credible, that is not just a media preference. It is a decision about whose narrative framework they will use to interpret events. The information war, the financial realignment, and the strategic doctrine gap are not three separate stories. They are three expressions of a single structural shift. And that structural shift is what the framework calls a civilizational transition. It does not happen at a press conference. It does not get announced. It accumulates transaction by transaction, platform by platform, framework by framework, until the day when the accumulated weight of the chain becomes visible, all at once to people who were not watching it develop. The framework predicted this, specifically, not vaguely, as some general tendency toward change. Specifically, that the pressure would produce the alternative, that the apparent setbacks would generate advances, and the opposing power would not understand the nature of what was happening until the transition was already advanced. Here's what I think is the most important insight from the framework we have been building across these videos. The framework says that civilizational transition do not look like what we imagine them to look like. We imagine them as dramatic, as visible, as announced. We imagine a moment of recognized defeat. But the evidence shows that the most significant transition happened in the gap between what a power believes about itself and what the world is actually doing around it. The transition is complete not when the declining power surrenders. It is complete when the world has recognized itself around a different center of gravity, and the declining power is still using a framework that assumes it is the center. That is the definition of what is happening right now. The Middle East, or what I want to call it, the West of Asia, has not fully pivoted. It is hedging, it is cautious, it is sophisticated. Saudi Arabia is still buying American weapons. The Gulf states still want US security guarantees. None of them have walked away. But they now have options they did not have 20 years ago. And having options changes everything. It changes the conversation. It changes the leverage. It changes the terms on which the leadership continues. The question is no longer, does America influence the Middle East? It influences it. The question is, on whose terms, under what conditions, at what cost, and how long? Those are different questions, and they lead to different answers than the one in the official documents. And let me close with something from the framework I have been drawing on these videos. It says this: the defeated will not know they have been defeated until the victors have built what comes next. I had spent this entire video documenting 3 dimensions of a shift that official Washington does not yet appear to understand. A narrative battle being lost in real time, a financial architecture being quietly bypassed, a strategic doctrine that its own authors acknowledge is already partially obsolete. And I want you to be careful about what, and I'm not claiming. I'm not claiming that any single actor has won definitively. I'm not predicting the end of US power as a global force. These transitions are long. They are non-linear. They involve setbacks and advances on both sides. What I'm claiming is that the phrase I just quoted from the framework. The victors have built what comes next. The question is, when does Washington realize it? And what does that moment look like when it arrives? Because that moment, the moment of recognition is itself as a historical event with enormous consequences. What a power does when it realizes that the framework it has been using to understand the world has stopped working. The decision shapes everything that comes next. In next video, we are going to look at one of the specific technology, one specific capability, one specific development that the framework identifies as the clearest single indicator where this transition is headed. This is the story that I'm going to talk about in my next video, and I will see you there. And if you're interested to see more about this kind of video, you can click on this one right here.